most of 28 and 30, 28 to 30. Jay, is there trouble with the sound? You don't? Okay, all right. If there's still if you can't hear, let me know. We got several on the live stream, so somebody said there was no sound. All right, Genesis 28 to 30 is where we are. We're following the life of Jacob. On now. All right, we're good. Following the life of Jacob, and Esau's kind of out of the picture for a few moments, but we're now starting to see the development of the nation of Israel. We're going to hit some highlights in chapter 30, not really covered a lot, but just kind of outline the birthing, if you will, of this nation, because it goes back to, chapter 23, where you have the birth and the promise of two nations. Chapter 25, verse 23, I had it backwards. Chapter 25, verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb. And, well, now that's what the book of Genesis is doing, is it's tracing the development of the nation. And, I've said this, we talked about it in terms of the creation account and all of this. The book of Genesis doesn't record everything that ever happened in the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then all their children. It just hits these points that are important for us to know, being recorded, of course, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We need to know these things because, once you get to the New Testament, okay, just so for instance, in Matthew 22, the Sadducees come to Jesus with a question about the resurrection, and part of his answer was, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, knowing the book of Genesis helps us see, the development of that family or that lineage. All right? So, the first 9 verses of chapter 28, a bride for Jacob and another for Esau. The way Esau handles himself here is kind of interesting to me. So, it's just like Abraham's request for Jacob. Where were they to seek a bride for themselves? Where were they supposed to seek them from? Yeah, go back home from my extended family and take your wives from those people, not from the people of Canaan. So it's very similar to Genesis 24, but it should also be connected with, I put in here, chapter 27 and verse 46. And really, as you're reading the text, just a natural flowing reading, Genesis 27:46 should really be Genesis 28 and verse 1, because the topic shifts. At the end of chapter 27, it's where Esau hates Jacob for what he's done, and Rebekah tells Jacob, you need to get out of town. Let your brother's anger abate a bit, and then come back. Well, then she begins, verse 46, talking about the wives of Isaac, or talking to Isaac about the daughters of Heth, who Esau had married. Hittites. Okay? So he got his wife from the wrong places. Well, then, from the wrong place, and then chapter 28, Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him, don't do what your brother did, basically. So you have the Abrahamic promise continued here, or extended rather, as I have it put in your outline. Verses 3 and 4, God Almighty bless thee and make thee fruitful and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people, okay, great nation, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee, and to thy seed with thee, inherit the land. So you've got those two specifically mentioned, but then just in general, the blessing of Abraham. And of course, with that comes the messianic promise of Christ coming. So the first few verses cover that, verses 1 through 5 of seeking a bride for Jacob. But then Esau, observing what happens and perhaps hearing what's being said, saw that Isaac blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram. Another word for that is Haran, which is where they came from, up far north, if you look on your biblical map, north, actually a bit north and east of Canaan, to take him a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. So what does Esau do? If you've read ahead. Where does he get? He gets another wife, but from what source, you might say? Verse 9. Ishmael, Abraham's son. It is Abraham's son by Hagar, right? But I put in your outline here, here's your first blank. Esau seemingly attempts to correct his problem. Correct. And that goes back to chapter 26, verses 34 and 35, which tells us about his two wives from the Hittites. Well, Ishmael's a descendant of Abraham. I see what Jacob has just done or been charged to do. So maybe this will be a step in the right direction. And I wonder, so the New Testament talks about Esau seeking repentance and not being able to find it, even though he sought it with tears. And I wonder if this is part of that process. The Bible calls him a profane person. He sold his birthright for a morsel of food. And it's like he's trying to, maybe the right way to say it, he's trying to equal his brother, trying to get back in the good graces of his parents. But this is not the way to do it. So anyway, Jacob obeyed his father, verse 7. That might have caused a little resentment based on everything that's happened so far. What has happened so far with Jacob and Esau? Kind of recap it for me. A couple different things have happened that have, you might say, driven a wedge in the family. What are they? Okay, he stole his birthright. He sold his birthright. Oh, I thought you said he stole his birthright. Yeah, he sold his birthright. Yeah. And then Jacob and Rebekah worked together to deceive Isaac, didn't they? So that the older would serve the younger. So things are not great in this family, let's say.
Maybe a little earlier than that, though, the parents put them at odds by having each one picking their favorite.
Yeah. Genesis 25, verses 27 and 28. Yep, that's a good point. Isaac loved Esau because of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So there are a lot of things going on here. Yeah, Connie says they're both parents have favorites, and that's not good in any family. That's certainly true. So while Ishmael was a descendant of Abraham, he was not the family lineage with whom to seek marriage. Because when you go back and you look at if you want to call it it's partly a blessing pronounced on Ishmael back in chapter 16, verses 11 to 12. This is what was said to Hagar. You're with child, you'll bear a son, you'll call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Okay, well, what's it going to be? He's going to be a wild man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man against him. So, he was blessed as a great nation. 12 princes come from Ishmael. But this is not the solution. And it's like Esau is doing what he can to, get in the good graces with his father maybe. Maybe something like that. So those are your first 9 verses. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay. Verses 10 to 22, Jacob's vision. So he travels, verse 10, Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. Beersheba's south in Canaan. Haran is far north. Haran, Padan, Aram, same place. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night till the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And what does he see in his sleep? Jacob's ladder, as we call it. And this is another example, and we've seen multiple examples in Hebrews. So far in Genesis, what I was getting ready to say is what Hebrews 1 says about God's mode of communication. God who at various times and in various ways spoke unto the fathers by the prophets. So he dreams a dream. Verse 12, ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And this is where the promise is further extended to Jacob, what we would call the messianic promise. So he travels from Beersheba to Bethel. It's about a 50-mile journey. And then from which this place is going to become known as Bethel. We'll read that in a minute. But then from Bethel to Haran's about 450 miles. Imagine traveling, however, I don't know how they were traveling. Maybe they got some pack animals and stuff like that. Maybe by foot, 500 miles. How long would that take? And then you stop occasionally. So, and that's one of the things about Genesis 2 is a great deal of time is passing. And sometimes I think when we read it just as a continuous flow, a historical narrative, we might fail to remember that there are not necessarily always great periods of time, but there are certain lengths of time that it takes to travel 500 miles. Again, with whatever mode of travel he's using here. So, somebody read for us here, verses 13 and 14. Genesis 28, 13 and 14. All right, so there again is that, like I said, that promise is extended. And so the next thing I have in your outline here, this event is mentioned by Jesus. We're going to go over there real quick to John 1, but notice that God is above the ladder. Did you pick that up as Derek was reading that? Okay. Turn over to John chapter 1 real quick, please. And I want, if somebody would, read verses 50 and 51. This is when Philip and Nathanael meet Jesus, and Jesus reveals something about having seen Nathanael, showing again Jesus' divine nature. But somebody read those two verses, John 1, 50 and 51.
Jesus answered and said unto him, Because I said unto thee, I saw thee under the fig tree, believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. And he said unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man.
Okay. Now, here in Genesis 28, it doesn't say anything about angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. It just says, Behold, the angels of God ascending and descending upon the ladder. But Jesus places himself there. Well, the idea here is, and I put it in your outline, the implication is that through the promises made to Abraham, a direct path to God in heaven would be made. Because again, at this point, you don't have the way of salvation revealed yet. And, if you're going to access God which has not been established yet either, but if you're going to access God under the Mosaic covenant, how do you have to do that? Through whom did you have to go? Levites. You had to go through the priesthood. Well, there's coming a time, and if you notice, and again in verses 12 to 14 here, back to Genesis 28, it's connected with the seed promise. This ladder is seen within that context. Jesus then references that event and places himself there. He is the direct access to the Father. Okay? I've got a couple verses from Hebrews. Who wants to read for me? Say, Hebrews 12, 22 to 24. What? Above the ladder? Yeah. Hebrews 12, 22 to 24. Who else wants to read? Hebrews 8, 1 and 2. 9:24. Read them when you get there. Okay? You've come to what did that first verse say? You've come to the heavenly Jerusalem? Yeah. It's talking about the church. And that's only made possible by Jesus and his accessing heaven. All right, who's got the next one? Hebrews 8, 1 and 2.
Now this is the main point of the things we are saying.
Okay? Hebrews 9:24.
Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the truth, but unto heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us.
This is the point of Jacob's ladder. It's within the context of the promise made to Abraham, extended to Isaac, and now, for at least a second time, extended to Jacob. Direct access to the Father. Okay? Verse 15, God's pronounced, going back to Genesis 28 now, God continues to bless him. I'm with thee, will keep thee in all the places whither thou goest, bring thee again into this land. So Jacob, I talked about this a bit last week. Jacob dies in faith, according to Hebrews chapter 11. But some of the events of his life cause you to wonder sometimes, don't they? His behavior. But the end of verse 15, I will not leave thee. Why? Why will God not leave Jacob? Even though his name means supplanter, and we see him doing that on multiple occasions. Why won't he leave him? I made a promise. And that's the nature of God. That's the character of God. He's a God who, when He gives His word, He will not break His word. And of course, this ultimately is in connection with the Messianic promise too. So, Jacob wakes up. Surely the Lord has been in this place, and he calls it, there in verse 17, this is none other than the house of God. And then, what does he call this place? He calls it the house of God, Bethel. When you see a Hebrew word or name and it ends in E-L, Daniel, Ezekiel, Bethel, that means something about God. And Beth, as we would say it, means house. Okay, another example of Bet meaning house. Bethlehem, house of bread. So it's kind of interesting when you know some of the information like that these names have significance. Bethel, because I encountered God here. This is where He is. So, look at verse 20. Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God be with me, and will keep me in this way. That sounds like Jacob is making it conditional, doesn't he? If God will do this for me, then I'll do this. Really, that word there, if, would better be translated since. God's made this promise. He's extended to me the Abrahamic promises a couple of times. So that's your next blank. If is used in the sense of since God will be with me. It was an expression of faith that God would keep His promises. You've got this direct line of communication through this dream. The Abrahamic promise extended, and well, since God's doing this, and be with me and give me bread to eat and clothes so that I come back here again, He will be my God. I'll serve Him. So, sense, S-I-N-C-E, it's in the sense of sense. That's the best way I knew to phrase it. It's in the sense of sense. It's kind of like there. You got 3 different ways to spell there. Same idea. Anyway. This stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, Bethel. And all that thou shalt give me, I surely will give the 10th unto thee. What is a tenth? What's a word that we hear often? Talked about it Sunday. The tithe, yeah. I'll give you a tenth of all. Abraham did that too, didn't he? With Melchizedek. Anyway, any questions on chapter 28? All right, chapter 29. I don't have a lot of comment on verses 1 to 14. It's just telling us what happens. Jacob going to find his wife. So, again, his 500-mile travel, and he meets Rachel. And you can read that for yourself. And perhaps you already have. We meet Laban here. Laban is, well, he does some things to Jacob that, if I believed in karma, it might be something along those lines. I don't. But, I'm just saying. Some interesting things happen here. Laban's decision. So he meets Rachel. And actually, he meets more than Rachel here. And we're going to read some interesting things. So verses 15 to 30, let's think about Laban's deceit. Laban had 2 daughters. The elder was Leah. Keep things in order. Remember this. Leah's the oldest. Rachel's the youngest. And there's some interesting discussion on verse 17. Leah was tender-eyed. Do any of you have a version that reads differently, or maybe a marginal reading that says something about that? Because listen to how the whole verse reads. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. Some versions say well-figured. It's a beautiful woman. Leah's eyes were delicate. Is that a New King James sounds like? Weak, yeah. So, there are 2 different ideas. One is she's practically blind. But the second idea is that the Hebrew wording there is hard to translate into English, and that it's a contrast between the beauty of Rachel and Leah's kind of hard to look at. I guess that's a nice politically correct way to put it. I don't know if that's true, but that's just, that idea is out there. Whatever the case may be, there's a contrast between these 2 women. Jacob loved Rachel. He's already met her, talked to her. Verses, again, 1 to 14. Okay? Work with me for 7 years and I'll give you Rachel. And verse 20 is interesting. It seems but a few days for the love he had to her. 7 years, that's a long time, isn't it? I've heard of engagements lasting that long. I might be offended. Anyway. Give me my wife. My days are fulfilled, verse 21. Okay, so this gets interesting. Looking at your outline here, I put the supplanter is supplanted in verses 21 to 25. Your next blank is everyone. Everyone had to be involved in this deception. Because what happens? He's worked for 7 years for whom? Rachel. What happens? He got Leah. Somebody tell me how that happens. I don't know. I don't know. Well, they couldn't break tradition. Right. But how did it happen? He knows who Rachel is. Yeah. Yeah. Verse 23, it came to pass in the evening that he, Laban, took Leah his daughter and brought her to him, and he went unto her. Came to pass in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Why have you done this to me? I served you for Rachel. Why have you beguiled me? I've told you more than once that sometimes the best answer I can give you is, I don't know. So that's what I'm going with tonight. But there was some deception here. Obviously, you beguiled me. Ideas are, at the wedding feast, everybody was there. He goes to the tent, whatever that looks like. It's dark. Leah's sent in. Guys, I don't know. Whatever the case may be, the supplanter is supplanted. And everybody had to be involved in this, including Rachel. And Reggie's right. This is the tradition. And Laban brings that out, doesn't he? It shouldn't be that the younger is married before the older. Verse 26. So fulfill her week. And I'll also give you her. Yeah. It's a good question. You can come back next week with a good answer. I don't know. It's interesting, to say the least. He worked if that were me, and I were, what would you say, blindsided like that, I might rethink another 7 years with this guy. Because when you marry somebody, don't you marry their family, in essence? I mean, that's... Well, let's not... Okay. Thank you. Whatever the case may be, he did another 7 years. And Laban gave to Rachel, his daughter Bilhah, his handmaid, to her. So there are 4 women now involved in this, aren't there? I kind of skipped over verse 24. Laban gave, so Jacob's got Leah. Well, he gave Leah Zilpah to be her, kind of like her helper. And then he gave Rachel Bilhah to be her maid. Now you got 4 women involved in this process. Okay? Jacob leaves this sequence with those 4, Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah. Leah starts having children. That's interesting because the Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. Rachel was the favored one. Do you see this? And I've said this a few times. Do you see this recurring theme of it happened back here and it's continuing, the favoritism? And, you know, Jacob was favored by somebody. Now Jacob favors somebody and things don't work out like he had planned. And they weren't going to work out the way the others had planned before. I mean, it's just... cycles. Families can create cycles. And, you know, I see it. You guys have seen it in families. A young man or a young woman will make a bad decision. And years down the road, having raised their children will make the same decision that mom or dad made before they were married. And it just, the cycle repeats itself. And I'm seeing that throughout these texts. So anyway, Leah has 4 children initially. So what I've got here in your outline is, so there are 12 tribes of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. So we're first told about Leah's first 4 children, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Okay? And then the text breaks there into chapter 30. Rachel couldn't have children. Chapter 30 and verse 1. Give me children, else I die. Well, what in the world can I do about it? What's the solution? Here's my handmaid. She has Dan and Naphtali. I mean, it's just laid out here. And then Zilpah has Gad and Asher. And then finally, Rachel has Joseph. And then some years later, which is all the way into chapter 35, which kind of jumping ahead there, but Rachel has Benjamin. What happens to her in her giving birth to Benjamin? She died. She named him, as that's going on, as she is expiring, she names him Ben-Omai, which means son of my sorrow. But they change his name to Benjamin in that text in Genesis chapter 35. So here is your, you might say, the development of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because, well, who's not one of the 12 tribes? Let's address that first. Of all these children. No. Who's not one of the 12 tribes that becomes a tribe in Israel? Joseph. Joseph, well, the sister too, yeah. But Joseph doesn't become a tribe. So we're lacking one there. Well, you got Ephraim and Manasseh that comes along later. So we'll get to all of that. There's not really a lot to add to that. Again, this is just the historical narrative telling us what happened. I tell you one thing that we could take away from this if we want to kind of wrap it up tonight with a lesson. So people ask a lot about concubines, which essentially in this culture was a wife, but a lesser wife. Lesser legal rights, things like this. So one thing you guys have heard me say is that God's marriage law goes all the way back to creation. And that's true. So how do you talk about Jacob's got 2 wives, right? Rachel and Leah. And now he's got 2, you might call them concubines. What are their names? Bilhah and Zilpah. So if somebody were to come to you and say, you believe the Bible, and the Bible says this about marriage, and yet all these people in the Bible have multiple wives, but then on top of the multiple wives, they have these maids or concubines. So what would the reasonable biblical response to that be? Because that's a subject that skeptics of the Bible will use to discredit the Bible. Any thoughts? Yeah? Because of the hardness of your hearts? Right? Just because it happened? Now, from the beginning, it was not so, and that's one thing we learn about the Bible from all three of the things you guys said. God had, from the beginning, a revealed will about marriage, didn't He? And you said, Kevin, what was it? How did you say it again? Because of hardness of your hearts. A lot of things. Yeah. That's the point I'm getting to. It's exactly the point. Are there any of these situations ever that worked out well? And what did you say, Jeff? Yeah. Right. The Bible records a lot of things done by people of God that got David. David had at least 8 wives, and one of them he got by adultery and murder. Doesn't mean God approves of that behavior. And that's I think that's one thing that, I hate to use the word argument, but that's an argument, you might say, that needs to be remembered. Number one, the Bible doesn't record everything that ever happened. But number two, the things that it does record doesn't mean God approves of everything that ever happened, even among His own people. So that's something to think about. So if Jacob's doing all of this, why would God continue to bless him? How would you answer that? We've talked about it. Why would God continue to bless him? Because He promised. And the promise is always connected back with Abraham, wasn't it? So far as we've seen throughout the book of Genesis, I made this promise to Abraham, I'm going to keep that promise.
Barry, I don't think it's that much different than like today. When we obey, we have a promise in heaven. It don't matter if we obey at 80 years old or if we obey it as a teenager and live our entire lives. The promise is the same. And it's in parables and we'll talk about it. That's the way God set it up. We did not like it. We can argue with it.
Yeah.
But it ain't going to get us anywhere. That's
Yep.
the way God set it up.
God made a promise. And Hebrews 6 is a great chapter in regard to the promise because it talks about what Jesus has done for us. He, as the forerunner, has gone into heaven before us, and that's the hope that we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. God makes a promise, He's going to keep it. But that doesn't relieve us. That doesn't mean that we can just go off and do whatever we want to do. His promises are conditional. But this promise and what's going on here, we can't ever separate it from the initial promise made to Abraham. And it's like Moses, as he's writing this, mentions that every single time. No, people have not changed. Yes. And that's, I'm glad Kevin said what he said in that regard is, okay, so they do all these things and all this is recorded for us, but Jacob, okay, Hagar and Sarah, how well did that work out? No, it didn't work out too well for them, did it? Jacob, all the favoritism. Joseph, you think about what happens with Joseph a little bit later down the road with the favoritism that Jacob shows to him, just like his mother showed for him, doesn't work out well. Never does. Maybe that's the ultimate lesson to take away. All right. So there's some other things I want to cover in chapter 30 next week, but I wanted to kind of get those 12 tribes lined out there. Appreciate your attention.